I want to begin this morning by talking a little bit about things that we don't like to talk about, right? I mean, there are those things that like we really don't want to talk about, but we feel the need to talk about. And I'll tell you one that we've become a little bit more familiar with than we want to, is this idea of online scams, right? So this is like actually kind of like a PSA, but also like hey, I know we don't want to talk about these things, but you need to know these things are going on. So one of the things that I'm familiar with, because I guess my generation was around when the advent of email and the internet and all that kind of stuff was proliferated. And so we used to get the fake Nigerian prince email scams, right? You know, I get an email, my name is Prince such and such, and I've got $60 billion in a bank account, and if you'll just give me, $5,000, then I'll give you access to that. That kind of thing. Fake celebrity interactions online. Listen, if Donald Trump emails you, please call me, okay? I'll show you how to make sure, A, that's not Donald Trump, because he's not going to email you, and then B, to keep you from getting scammed some more. That's happening, right? There's jury duty scams, right, that have gone around. I don't know if y'all have heard about these. These are pretty significant, like where somebody calls you and you hear police chatter in the background, and they're like, hey, you missed your jury summons, and I'm dispatching officers to your location to arrest you. And they make you stay on the phone with them the whole time. They try to convince you that there are literally officers that are going to come and put you in handcuffs in front of your coworkers or family, unless you go and you pay them, and it's usually in some weird Bitcoin, Coinstar kind of thing. There are the fake online scams where somebody, you try to buy something from Marketplace, and without ever seeing it, you transfer the money, and all of a sudden that person disappears, right? I'm saying these things because we actually know these things are happening in Scottsboro, okay? There's another one, the toll booth scam. Y'all gotten that text message recently, right? You have outstanding tolls. I got that for the first time like 2 weeks ago, and I was like, oh, that's the one, block, right? Hope they don't come get me for those unpaid tolls from that place I've never been to, that kind of thing. The one that's almost gotten several of our staff members, right, is we're getting, and maybe you're getting this too, you'll get an email, and the name in the sender section is Dr. Ryan Johnson or Pastor Ryan Johnson, right? And it'll say, hey, I need you to go and get me, gift cards or something like that. No, I'm not going to call you or email you and ask you to go get iTunes gift cards or Amazon gift cards or whatever. But the way to know if that is truly me emailing you is click the name, look at the email address behind it. If it's anything other than Pastor Ryan at agapebaptist.com, just go ahead and block that email, right? Because it's usually like office mail, abcxyz at outlook.com or something. It's some weird email address. And that one has been going around. We'll send a text message on the staff text thread saying, I got another email from Dr. Ryan, and it's like, I'm like, really, what do I want you to go do now? Buy me like paint samples or something, whatever. It's weird. And the thing that's coming, y'all, and I say this because once again, it's unpleasant to talk about, but it's coming, is the reality of AI voice scams, right? So if y'all were here for the 25th anniversary celebration, you know how easy it is to clone somebody's voice, like Morgan Freeman. That we did not actually get Morgan Freeman to do our 25th anniversary video. That was a little creative work from our team here. That's meaning Ryan late at night figuring out something funny to do, right? So, but when you get a phone call and you say hello, and you don't hear anybody on the other end, don't keep talking. Just go ahead and hang up, right? Because what they could be trying to do, and I'm not meaning to like incite fear or anything, but what they could be trying to do is get a sample of your voice, because we know, this has happened, we know that there was a mom who got a call from her daughter that her daughter had been kidnapped, and that she needed to pay this ransom. And she couldn't get off the phone. And what they had done is they took a sample of this young girl's voice somehow, YouTube or whatever, and created an AI voice model and literally, this parent's like texting her daughter, and her daughter's like, I'm fine, I'm at school, checking location, all that kind of stuff. But that's coming. That's one of those things. So if you get a phone call, nobody answering on the other end, just hang up. You get an email that looks weird asking you to go buy gift cards, just block that person. And once again, this is another thing. If you don't know how to do that, hey, there ain't no shame in asking, right? I've had to walk Gary through it enough, right, with emails that he's gotten, text messages. Dakota has gotten some. And so this would be a way that we'd love to serve you. If you kind of look at that smartphone in your lap and you're like, this thing scares me to death. In fact, maybe what I just told you makes you want to throw it out the window, which may not be a bad idea. But if you don't know how to do that and that's a service that you need, know that you've got some techie people on staff here that we'd love to help you with that. Because the last thing that I want to hear is you losing a significant amount of money or being sent on a wild goose chase or thinking the cops are about to come get you because you got scammed. That's, like I said, that's one of those things that we don't like talking about, but it's happening around us. The other thing that we don't like talking about, and maybe this is not you, but I've heard this from people as they come into the church, they don't really like talking about sin. Sin's an issue. If you've been with us since the beginning of the history series, you know sin's an issue. You were here in Genesis, and it's like, hey, we made it 2 chapters in the garden, right, and all of a sudden we're cast out because of sin. We're separated from God because of sin. When we talk about sin, sometimes people get really uncomfortable. They don't want you talking about specific sins. Maybe they want you talking about, just keep sin, the conversation about sin in generalities, right? But if you look at Scripture, there's a pretty significant, emphasis put on dealing with sin. Like, for instance, in the Christian life, Hebrews chapter 12, verse 1 says, therefore, since we are surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses, let us also lay aside every weight and sin which clings so closely, or the sin that so easily entangles. Think about Jesus as a recipe for dealing with sin. If your eye caused you to sin, tear it out. If your leg or your hand caused you to sin, cut it off. Now that's hyperbole, right? Jesus is not actually telling you to mutilate a part of your own body, but he's saying get radical in dealing with sin because sin is such a big deal. We've seen when we're going through Romans 6, it said, 6:12 says, let not sin reign therefore in your mortal body to make you obey its passions. And then 6:23 says, for the wages of sin is death, right? And so sin is not something that we mess around with. It may not be something that you like talking about. It may be an uncomfortable topic, but at the same time, it's a necessary topic. It's kind of like going to the doctor and the doctor looking at me like he did 6 or 8 months ago and said, hey, you need to lose some weight. And I'm like, what if I looked at him and said, that hurts my feelings, right? Doc, I really wish you could use kinder words, right? Please speak more softly to me. My nice bearded doctor he might have slapped me. Honestly, that's the kind of I want the kind of doctor who's like, if I can slap you and inflict some pain on you so that I don't have to do surgery on you, that would be great too, right? But honestly, this idea of, well, I don't like hearing about it, so can we not talk about it, right? It doesn't fly in the Johnson house. It's not going to fly in Agape Baptist Church. And so if sin makes you uncomfortable this morning, I don't want you to leave, and I don't want you to check out. Here's what I want to ask you, is why? Why? That's a little bit rhetorical, but honestly, it's meant to be reflective. Why would the church, speaking out of Scripture that emphasizes the need to deal with sin, why would that hit you the way that it does? I'm going to get to that at the end, but because I've got an idea, not only for why we feel uncomfortable talking about sin, but also how to respond to that. And so this whole series, though, has been about us going through and seeing the deadly effects of sin in the lives of God's people and the depths of his mercy. Like I've already said, in Genesis, Adam and Eve were kicked out of the garden. In Exodus, Pharaoh was humbled and fell under the judgment of God. In Numbers, Israel had its own sin issues. You had the earth opening up and swallowing people because of sin. In Judges, you see the worst kinds of objectification and victimization and dehumanization between Israelites, people in Israel who have forgotten God. They're living as practical atheists. And as they do that, they are doing some of the worst things like kidnapping and human trafficking and child sacrifice. They've completely blended in with the nations around them. And yet, in all of it, we've also seen God's mercy. In light of sin corrupting humanity the way that it has, we've seen God's mercy to give his promises of how he's going to deal with sin. Last week we saw sin ruin the lives of Israel's first king, Saul, only to hear about God raising up a man that was meant to be an example of the kind of heart that God commends. And that young man at the time was named David. Remember, David was humble. David was a worshiper. In fact, next week we're going to be looking at all of the book of Psalms. You thought 50 chapters in Genesis was a feat? Try 150 Psalms in a Sunday. That's next week. You're like, I'm going to skip that day. Okay, it's normal time frame for a worship service. Don't get crazy. But we also saw that David was loyal to godly allegiances and cultivated God-centered relationships. David was kind of a figure of hope there as the book of 1 Samuel came to an end. We ended a couple of weeks ago by rejoicing in David's humility and seeing the trademarks of a person after God's own heart. And this week, from the same man, sadly, we're going to learn painfully about the universal landmarks on the pathway to failure, which is what 2 Samuel is about. But remember, the whole purpose of this series is so that you can get a grasp of what God is doing in the big picture of his story. Because in his story, you will find your story. By knowing him, you will find greater insight on yourself. Last week we looked at 1 Samuel, and I think I've told you at certain points that in the Hebrew Bible that there are these books that are combined. And 1 and 2 Samuel was actually one book in the Hebrew Bible. It was one scroll that told the stories of these three main characters, Samuel, Saul, and David. And at the end of 1 Samuel, King Saul had died. And at the beginning of 2 Samuel, we find David, who'd been anointed as the next king many years before Saul's death, being told the news. And so in 1 Samuel, we saw that God is the God of the heart. But in 2 Samuel, we are going to see that God is still the God of the throne, even when the human leader in power doesn't follow him perfectly. And so let's look first this morning at the rise of King David and try to understand and get our mind wrapped around why this book divided out as 2 Samuel, how the story flows in here. So 2 Samuel chronicles David's kingship in two movements. The first is in chapters 1 through 10, and the second is in chapters 11 through 20. And so maybe this is something that you would want to write above the book title. Above 2 Samuel, it would say two sections, 1 through 10, is the first kind of segment, and 11 through 20 is the second. This is David's kingship in two movements. And then in chapters 21 through 24, the author writes an epilogue that serves as a conclusion to the entire books of 1 and 2 Samuel. In chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, David hears about Saul and Jonathan's death. And just like we saw in 1 Samuel, where we said that Hannah's poem encapsulates the message of both 1 and 2 Samuel, the first chapter of this book, 2 Samuel, contains some pretty incredible foreshadowing that we really can't skip over. And so look at verses 25 through 27. So this is David lamenting for Saul and Jonathan. And remember from 1 Samuel, Jonathan is David's BFF, right? They are brothers from another mother. They are best of friends, right? And David and Jonathan, they battle together. Jonathan protects his best friend David from his father Saul, who is trying to kill him. And so David hears about his best friend's death. He hears about the king of Israel, Saul's death. And look at what he says in verse 25. How the mighty have fallen in the midst of battle. Jonathan lies slain on your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Very pleasant you have been to me. Your love to me was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. How the mighty have fallen, and the weapons of war have perished. Now, I will tell you, just as a side note here, because I realize we've got a lot of age disparity here. We got a lot of younger kids that are on social media, and so sadly, verse 26 is one of the verses that people point to say that they try to make this case that David and Jonathan had something greater than a friendship, if you will. That David, they used, sadly, interestingly, they used David as some kind of Old Testament figure that they can identify with their movement, right? All based on these few words, right? That David is saying that Jonathan, that his love for him was extraordinary, surpassing the love of women. And what I think that speaks to is twofold. One, it speaks to the propensity and the tendency of a human heart to distort Scripture, right? And to make it say something it doesn't say. But it also speaks to how unusual close male friendships have gotten in our day and age, which is an absolute tragedy. And I think is one of the reasons that we see suicide rates so high in men, that we see heart disease and other illnesses so high in men, is because Satan's first tool in your life to do his bidding is to isolate you. And so men, I want to tell you, you need to have close friends. You need to have very, very close personal friends who know you, who can ask you the tough questions. And you may not use David's language to characterize your friendship with him. I can honestly say I don't have any man in my life that I would say that their love for me surpasses the love of like my wife. Right? I wouldn't say that, but I would say that there are men that I would absolutely fight alongside and die with. I would say that there are men that I would fight for and I would fight to defend. That if I got a phone call right now about certain men in my life, that I would pass off this service to somebody else and I would run to their side to make sure that they knew that that's how much they meant to me. Right? Men, don't be afraid to cultivate close friendships with others. That may not be your style, but I do think that is a need that you have. And it's one of those things that I've been really blessed to see over the last several years as God has been doing a work in our men, especially out of the Wednesday night Bible study, of the Man Church Bible study. We've seen friendships spawn out of there that go beyond just, hey, I'm on a Wednesday night, but hey, daily encouragement, accountability, how can I pray for you, those kind of things. Men, we don't need to be afraid of friendships like that. And if you're a man in this room and you don't have friendships like that, then I want to encourage you to dig deeper into the community here at Agape and find godly men who can speak into your life. They may be older than you, they may be younger than you, but as long as they're walking the same path, which means following Jesus, then cultivate those kind of friendships because we all need them. And so that's kind of a side note. But the whole point of David's psalm here in 2 Samuel 1 is to say that he is devastated that the mighty Jonathan and Saul have fallen. But the reason I would tell you to highlight this verse, and it's interesting that he says it twice, which kind of amplifies it, is because that's exactly what's going to happen to David throughout the course of this book. David begins 2 Samuel lamenting how the mighty have fallen in Saul and Jonathan. But by the end of the book, we're going to say the same thing about David. How the mighty have fallen. Now, the first thing that indicates that David is not going to do well in this book, as he laments over Jonathan, his best friend, who is a godly man, is that he is anointed king of Judah, and Jonathan gets replaced by a yes man named Joab. Once again, men, if you only have people in your life who just kind of shine you on and flatter you and tell you what you want to hear, those are not true friendships. It's the men that'll get in your face and tell you that you're doing something wrong, or to tell you that you're working too much, you're spending too much time there at work, and you need to spend more time with your family. You need to cultivate that time with your kids while you can. You need to continue to date your wife, whatever it may be. Whatever the hard things will look like in your life, you need friendships with men who will be able to look at you and say those kinds of things. David does not get another Jonathan in Joab. Joab is a yes man for David, and that leads him down a path that he should never go down. And so in chapters 2 through 6, David is established as the king of Judah. He experiences success and is marked by God's blessing as he always has been. The people of Israel unify under David as he captures Jerusalem, renames it Zion, and makes it both the political and religious capital of the nation of Israel. So go over to chapter 7. So in chapter 7, the nation of Israel is at rest under the leadership of King David. So think about what we've come through. We've come from Egypt, gone through the 40 years in the wilderness. We went to Canaan. That Joshua had some victories there, but they immediately went into tribalism and into forgetting God, and the nations around them were plaguing them. Then they cried out for a king after the civil war that they were experiencing. Saul had some degree of unity with Israel, but Saul was not a righteous man, and so he did not lead well. So David finally is leading in such a way that the nation has rest. And so basically in chapter 7, David looks at God and says, hey, since we're now at home in Jerusalem, I want to build you a home here as well. God says, not you. I don't want that. And he gives them this promise instead that says, hey, instead of you building a house for me, David, I'm going to actually build a dynasty through you. This chapter, 2 Samuel 7, is the key for us understanding the rest of the storyline of the entire Bible. As we get into Israel's history, let's remember why Israel was established in the first place. God promised Abraham in Genesis chapter 12 that he was going to establish Abraham's family, the nation of Israel, in order to restore his blessing to the nations on earth. And all along we've heard about the ruler coming from Israel, from the tribe of Judah. And now we're told this ruler will be, look at verse 13, will be from the family of David. And as this ruler takes his throne, he shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. Now you've already sung about this morning in that fourth verse of the song King of Kings, that the church of Christ was born after Jesus rose from the grave and put his spirit within his people. And that's the house that is now being built and will one day travel into eternity, into a kingdom that's there. But right now, we're establishing God's kingdom here on earth through the church. And so after chapter 7 and in chapters 8 through 10, there's more of a chronicle of David's successes, including military victories over the Philistines, the Ammonites, the Syrians, but also a very touching story that kind of provides some context for why we do things like Night to Shine, and why we're starting this new venture about Gideon's Garden Kids next week. And it's this really touching story about David taking care of Jonathan's son in chapter 9. Now, so go to chapter 9 real quick, because this will be a fun little exercise for us, right? So David says in verse 1, is there still anyone left of the house of Saul that I may show him kindness for Jonathan's sake? And they find out that Jonathan's son is still alive. But in the process of escaping, when Saul died and Jonathan died, that he was dropped as a child and it injured his feet. And so here's a really fun Hebrew name to say, and that is, let's just actually repeat it after me. Say, Meh, Fi, Bo, Sheth. Okay, let's one more time. That was kind of weak. I know it's scary. It's Hebrew, right? We're not speaking in unknown tongues, okay? But it is a foreign tongue. So Meh, Fi, Bo, Sheth. Okay, now on 3, put it all together. 1, 2, 3. Mephibosheth. Hey, good job. Y'all are Hebrew scholars. Mephibosheth, right? So Mephibosheth is this disabled child that can never do anything but David, but remind him of Jonathan's love for him. And I want to tell you that as we welcome these families with these caregivers in, And kids, especially youth in here, you're going to see kids that maybe look different than you. You're going to see people who may act different than you. But just like Mephibosheth was a reminder to David of Jonathan's love, these individuals that are going to come into our church that we're going to have an opportunity to serve are a reminder that even though sin has corrupted this world and results in a number of things that we can't control, God's still the God of the throne. And these people are here to serve as a reminder of how precious life is and of how much God loves us. And I didn't realize this until I met a man named Keith Barnes. Keith had a daughter named Jessica. It was his oldest daughter. Keith's wife, Debbie, she played organ for us at my previous church. And I didn't get a chance to meet Keith because he never came to church. And so I was a young guy and didn't really have a lot of tact or emotional intelligence. And so I just kind of wrote Keith off as kind of like, well, wife comes to church, husband doesn't. It's a typical story, right? And then I finally had the opportunity to meet Keith, and Keith said, hey, I just want to let you know, because we'd started a live stream similar to what we did here when I came to Agape. And he said, thank you so much for that live stream. He said, me and Jessica watch church every Sunday morning. I said, oh, really? And he said, yeah. And he said, can I show you my Jessica? And he pulls out his phone, and he shows me this 23-year-old girl who was definitely not the size of a baby, and yet he was cradling her in his arms like a baby. Because Jessica had a version of Down syndrome to where she was nonverbal, she couldn't do much of anything at all. And so Keith looked at his wife, Debbie, and said, you go serve the Lord and play organ, take our daughters, I'm going to serve the Lord, and I'm going to take care of Jessica. And Keith looked at me and he said, this is what I get to experience on a daily basis. Is this 23-year-old girl who still loves me and looks at me like I'm her father, and I'm holding her as a baby, even though she's not a baby. He said, that's what I get to do for the rest of my life with Jessica. And I said, you are doing the Lord's work, my friend. And so I want to encourage you, if people with special needs intimidate you, then maybe you need to be one of the first ones that signs up to volunteer for the Gideon's Garden class. Because you're going to see a side of things that reminds you of God's good care for you as a father looks after his children, even when they're helpless. That's the story of Mephibosheth. That's why we do Night to Shine. That's why we're doing Gideon's Garden Kids. If you'll notice, there's QR codes around the church that have a wish list, an Amazon wish list. You can go and you can buy things that they're going to need for that class, like sensory items, and would encourage you to be a part in that way. So now we've seen the fall of Saul. We've seen the success of David, but now we're going to turn and see the tragic fall of David. Oh, how the mighty have fallen. Look at chapters 11 and 12. It tells the very familiar story of David's sin with Bathsheba and his murder of her husband Uriah. And so how do we go from success to failure so quickly? Well, look at this quote by Randy Alcorn. He says, immorality is the cumulative product of small indulgences and minuscule compromises, the immediate consequences of which were at the time indiscernible. It's like the old Casting Crowns song. It says it's a slow fade when black and white turns to gray. That's what Randy Alcorn's saying. He's saying the small indulgences and the minuscule compromises, they don't seem like much at all. They don't seem like they have huge consequences, but they do. And that is the story of David. So let's look at where it started. And these all alliterate, so you'll be able to make sure you can write them down and remember them. First of all, we see compromise. It's in 2 Samuel 5:13, but you don't have to turn back there. It says, and David took more concubines and wives from Jerusalem after he came from Hebron, and more sons and daughters were born to David. This was something that God never intended, was for polygamy to become the norm among the people of Israel. In fact, Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, is under the subheading, Laws Concerning Israel's Kings. Listen to what Deuteronomy 17:17 says. And the king shall not acquire many wives for himself, lest his heart turn away, nor shall he acquire for himself excessive silver and gold. It was never God's will for Saul or David or Solomon after David to go that route. David's polygamy was not prescribed by God, but rather was a cultural practice that David should have rejected. This is sexual immorality and objectification. Everything that you do is a result of what you believe. This compromise eventually leads David to believe he is entitled and can have any woman he wants. Does that sound familiar? Well, then we hear about comfort, right, in chapters 2 through 10. God had blessed David, but notice where comfort leads the unguarded heart. Comfort leads the unguarded heart to a very specific place. There's one theologian who put it this way. He said, the power of temptation is not in its appeal to our baser instincts or to the things that we just are, that we'd say, ugh, right? If that were the case, it would be natural to be repulsed by whatever that temptation is. The power of temptation is in its appeal to our idealism. It's an appeal to our idealism. It's in those areas of our life where we kind of don't have a firm conviction, right? Temptation sneaks in and tries to appeal there to get us to compromise. Well, that compromise and that comfort leads to David's complacency. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 11, verse 1. It says, in the spring of that year, the time when kings go out to battle, David sent Joab and his servants with him and all Israel, and they ravaged the Ammonites and besieged Rabbah, but David remained at Jerusalem. Where should David be? David should be leading his army to battle, but comfort led him to complacency. That complacency leads him to carelessness. Look at verses 2 and 3 of 2 Samuel 11. It happened late one afternoon when David arose from his couch, once again being lazy, and was walking on the roof of the king's house, that he saw from the roof a woman bathing, and the woman was very beautiful. And David sent and inquired about the woman, and one said, is not this Bathsheba, the daughter of Eliam, the wife of Uriah the Hittite? David shirked responsibility, and then he got lazy. An idle mind is the devil's playground, my friends. Arguing with desire always leads to sin. We're called to flee from it. Not argue with it. Not toy around with the moral turpitude involved with it. We need to reject those desires and actively pursue God, and that's what results in standing firm in redemption and faithfulness. So you know how the story goes. David got Bathsheba pregnant and then realized that he needed to fix the problem with what he created, so he got Joab to send Uriah home, but Uriah was nobler than David. He was an excellent warrior who did not leave his master's side, and he wouldn't go be with his wife. So that leads David to conspiracy. David figures out he has to take it a step further. He involves Joab in his plan. He sends Uriah to the front line. Uriah is killed. And what follows next are the 3 C's of callousness, chaos, and conviction. What were we rejoicing in a couple weeks ago? Oh, the humility of David. Look how great David is. Oh, how tragic his fall. You know that the thing that you've done is wrong. You know that you need to repent, but that would take humility. So we hide it. We bury it deep within us, hoping that it will never come back up. But what you don't realize is that in doing so, you are desensitizing yourself to the voice of the Lord, and you are normalizing walking out of fellowship with Him. How did David do this? How did David make himself seem like the hero? He takes Bathsheba as his wife, and he makes himself look like he's still the hero of the story. He covers it up by saying, "Oh, I've got a warrior whose wife is widowed. I'm going to make sure she's taken care of and she never has a need again." Yeah. The most miserable person in the world is not the person who doesn't know Christ. It's the Christian that is walking against Christ. Let me say that again. The most miserable person in the world is not somebody who's lost out in their sin. The most miserable person in the world is the Christian who is walking against God. And so you know how the story goes. David acts like he's the hero for about a year, and then Nathan, the prophet, is called in, and he's called in to deal with David. David is confronted, and he repents, but not after all of this internal turmoil that David goes through. You say, well, I don't see it in 2 Samuel. That's right, you wouldn't, because it's in the Psalms. Psalm chapter 51 shows us that he tried to bury it. He tried to look like the hero, but he knows his transgressions and his sin is ever before him. That's Psalm 51:3. But then we see in Psalm chapter 66, verses 17 and 18, he says, "I cried to him with my mouth, and high praise was on my tongue. if I had cherished iniquity in my heart, the Lord would not have listened. And this doesn't apply to all of you, but maybe some of you are in here this morning and you're like, I just struggle to sing. I struggle to sing with any kind of insight that my praises rise to God's ears. You need to recognize the reason that you feel that, maybe the reason you feel that, is because you have cherished sin in your heart. And the Lord is trying to get your attention by putting you in a state to where He's saying, I don't hear your praises. I mean, it's kind of one of those things He does, but He's not accepting them. We also get it in Psalm chapter 32, verses 3 and 4. David writes, For when I kept silent, my bones wasted away through my groaning all day long. For night and day your hand was heavy upon me. My strength was dried up as by the heat of summer. David was in a state of internal turmoil because he could hide what he did from so many other people, but he could not hide from God. He couldn't hide from himself. So David is confronted, but the damage is done. Chapters 14 through 20 show us that the choices that we make influence the lives of our children in untold ways. That turmoil inside of David, all the compromises that he had made, it spread like an infection to his family and to his kingdom as his son Absalom stages a rebellion and David is on the run again. This time not from the king of Israel, but this time from his son who's tried to become the king of Israel and sets himself up as the king of Israel. David is a broken man. As he returns to his throne, all he can do is dwell upon the sad consequences of his life. So I want to end just with a brief illustration. I said that maybe the reason that you're uncomfortable, if you're uncomfortable today talking about sin, or if you really don't like talking about sin, maybe the reason you're uncomfortable talking about sin, it could have something to do with this illustration. There was a teacher who said, he stood on a stage like this one time and he said he was holding a glass of water, right? And he said, suppose I hold this glass of water and I shake it. Water spills out. And you ask me, well, why did the water spill out? Well, the instinctive answer is water came out because you shook it, right? I mean, that's obviously the reason that water came out. But there's another correct answer, which is water came out because that's what was on the inside of the glass in the first place. It was water. If there hadn't been any water in the glass in the first place, no water would have ever come out of the glass. If I shake an empty glass, nothing comes out. Sure, it came out because it was shaken, but the water came out because water was on the inside. And so if we ask David, why did you do what you did? He might say, well, I did it because I was tempted, because of pressure. I was, as it were, shaken. My equilibrium was disturbed by outside influences. Things happened to me. I was weary. I looked out of the window and saw this beautiful woman, and one thing led to another. I was shaken. That's what we instinctively say. I said that because I was stressed. I did that because I was tired or sick. My upbringing has conditioned me to react that way. Now listen, there may be some truth to that. Once again, just like there's truth that there was water in the glass and it spilled because I shook it. But David's answer in Psalm 51 is, I committed adultery because there's adultery in my heart. The really shocking thing I've discovered, says David, is that what I did expressed who I am. Evil came out of me because I have allowed evil to reside in me. On this side of heaven, we will never be holy as God is holy. The Spirit of God has been put in every child of God to sanctify them, to make them look more like Jesus. But remember Romans 8, the final step is glorification, which happens in eternity, not on earth. And so we're always going to struggle with sin. But Paul in Philippians 4 helps us understand that what you put in is what's going to come out. What you, and it's not just what you put in terms of like, just what you listen to or just what you watch or just the people that you're around. Because once again, Jesus, the holiest man that ever walked on the face of this earth, was around a bunch of sinful people for his entire life and never sinned once, right? So you may have a greater tolerance for something than I do, or I may have a greater tolerance for something than you do. Remember, that was Romans 14. But the fact of the matter is that it's not just about what we expose ourselves to or what we listen to or what we watch. It's about what we delight in. It's about what we treasure. It's about what we celebrate. It's about what we devote our time to. It's about what eventually ends up consuming us. And maybe the reason that people don't like hearing about the holiness of God or talking about sin is because that sin shouts, "You are not holy like your Creator." And when we hear about God's holiness, there's only one conclusion that can be drawn, and that is, I deserve judgment. And I want to tell you today, I deserve judgment because I am not holy like my God is holy. I don't like being called out any more than you do. Max I think it's a running joke. Max tells me I need to write a book about parenting. And then guess what kind of week I have in parenting after he tells me that? A week that reminds me I don't need to write a book about parenting, right? Because somebody's crying because of me, or I got short-tempered with somebody, or I said something I didn't need to say. I deserve the judgment of God. And God's holiness declares to me, Ryan, you deserve the judgment of God. And you say, well, Ryan, if that's what God's holiness declares to you, then why in the world would we sing songs like, "Holy, holy, holy, Lord God Almighty, who was and is and is to come"? Wouldn't we run away from God's holiness? Yes, if it weren't for the cross. The cross of Jesus Christ is where the holiness of God, the justice of God, intersects for all eternity with the mercy of God and the love of God for sinners just like us. And if you are in here today and either A, you're uncomfortable with God's holiness because you're cherishing sin, you need to go to the cross and see how serious your sin is, that the Son of God had to be crucified, His blood had to be spilled for you and for me, so that God's holiness and justice would fall upon Him, so that you and I could have redemption and forgiveness. But maybe you might be on another side. It's not that God's holiness makes you uncomfortable, it's just you don't care. Because you don't think you need forgiveness, or you don't think you deserve judgment. And I want to tell you, maybe if you can't feel it in that vertical relationship between you and God as we sing, maybe I would just ask you to look around at the people in your life. How are they being affected by you being consumed with yourself? Because, friends, I've lived that life. And I've hurt people. And I can tell you that I left many people, before I came to know Jesus, I left many people in the wake of my decisions and my lashing out and my anger and my choices that I really, really wish that I could go and make right. And so God's holiness for us, it may make us uncomfortable, but that's a feature, not a bug. That's the reason for it. As you sing about God's holiness, you're holding in tension your deserving verdict of judgment and God's wonderful invitation of grace and mercy. And the glorious thing is that every single day of our life, as you get shaken by those situations in your life, you can try to justify it all you want, or you can say, yep, that evil in me needs to be dealt with, and so I need to be at the foot of the cross. Lord, I need you. If that's you today, I want to invite you. I really do. I want to invite you during this time of invitation to embrace your need. Embrace the fact that you are worthy of judgment. that you are worthy of condemnation because of the sin that has separated you from God, but Jesus came to open a door, and now it's like he stands here with arms open wide to receive those who would say, I want to come to you, Jesus, because you are the one who took on my sin, you took on my shame, you took on all the things that I could never pay for on my own, except with my own life, and spend an eternity separated from God in a place called hell. I want to come through Jesus, and I want to take his holiness and his righteousness because he took my sin and my shame. If we don't accept that, then it's like us looking at his sacrifice and saying, yeah, I don't need that. It's just dismissing it. But whether we're a believer and we embrace that sacrifice and we celebrate that victory day after day after day after day, that's God's design for us. Or maybe today, for the very first time, you need to embrace Jesus as Savior and treasure and say, yes, I need that. I need to come into a relationship with the one who can take that wrath from God's holiness off of me, that can take my judgment and give me life. Because I don't want to continue to spread death around me. I want to spread life around me, and that can only happen as we walk with Jesus. David had to learn that after a life of successes and failures and comforts and complacency and callousness and then calamity hitting his life and dividing his family. What have you learned? Is it enough to make you run from your sin and into the arms of Christ? I hope so today. If so, there's going to be some folks standing here down front as we enter into this time of invitation. And if that's you today, if you need Jesus, if you need to come into a relationship with Jesus, they would love to have the opportunity to show you what it means to put your full faith and trust in him as we come and we sing praises to him once again. And we look forward to that time where glorification will be complete and we're gathered around the throne with all the saints declaring his holiness. That's the offer of this invitation today. Let's pray.